In 1893, wealthy New Yorkers walking past Fifth Avenue and 33rd Street encountered something they had never seen before. Right in the middle of Manhattan's most exclusive neighborhood, someone had built a spite fence. Not just any fence. A 13-story spite fence made of brick, mortar, and pure family hatred. The fence wasn't actually a fence. It was a hotel. But calling it a hotel missed the point entirely. The Waldorf Hotel was built for one reason and one reason only: to ruin the life of the man living next door. This is the story of how America's greatest hotel was born from a family feud so bitter that it consumed 2 generations, destroyed relationships, and almost bankrupted one of the wealthiest families in American history. How 2 cousins who despised each other accidentally created the standard for luxury hospitality while trying to destroy each other, and how their war turned into an empire that would define what it meant to be rich in America. But to understand why someone would build a 13-story middle finger on Fifth Avenue, we need to go back to where this hatred started. Back to a family that came to America with nothing and built one of the largest fortunes in the world. Back to John Jacob Astor, the man who started it all. Before we continue into the family feud that built America's most famous hotel, subscribe for more true stories behind legendary places and real history. John Jacob Astor arrived in America from Germany in 1784 with 7 flutes and $25. Within 40 years, he was the richest man in the United States. He made his fortune in fur trading, buying pelts from trappers in the American frontier and selling them to Europe and China. Then he pivoted to real estate in Manhattan, buying up huge chunks of undeveloped land that would eventually become some of the most valuable property in the world. When Astor died in 1848, he was worth an estimated $20 million, which would be over $500 million today. But he didn't split that fortune equally among his children. He left the vast majority of it to his son William Backhouse Astor, believing that dividing the fortune would weaken it. William followed his father's philosophy. He continued buying Manhattan real estate and consolidated the family wealth. When William died in 1875, he also left almost everything to one son, John Jacob Astor III. The pattern repeated: keep the fortune concentrated, keep the Astor name powerful. But William had made one critical mistake. He had 2 sons, not one. And the second son, William Waldorf-Astor, was not the kind of man who accepted being second in anything. William Waldorf-Astor was brilliant, ambitious, and absolutely convinced that he deserved to be the head of the Astor family. He had studied at Columbia and Heidelberg. He had served in the New York State Assembly and as U.S. Minister to Italy. He saw himself as a statesman, a scholar, and the rightful heir to the Astor legacy. But his older brother, John Jacob Astor III, was technically the family patriarch, even though William Waldorf had more ambition and political connections. And that created a power struggle that might have stayed manageable if not for the women. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, married to William Waldorf's father, was the undisputed queen of New York society. Everyone called her Mrs. Astor because there was no other Mrs. Astor who mattered. She decided who was invited to the best parties. She determined who was socially acceptable and who wasn't. Her annual ball was the most important social event in America. If you weren't invited, you didn't exist. Caroline lived in a mansion at 5th Avenue and 33rd Street, right in the heart of the best neighborhood in Manhattan. And next door, in another mansion on the same block, lived her nephew William Waldorf Astor with his wife Mary. Mary Astor thought she should be called Mrs. Astor, now that she was married to William Waldorf, who was from the younger generation. Caroline thought that was ridiculous. There was only one Mrs. Astor, and it was her. The 2 women barely spoke to each other, despite living literally next door. When William Waldorf's father died in 1890, the family tension reached a breaking point. William Waldorf had inherited a massive fortune, but Caroline still controlled New York society. She still lived next door. She still called herself Mrs. Astor, and she still refused to acknowledge Mary as an equal. William Waldorf Astor decided he had had enough, not just of Caroline, but of America entirely. In 1891, he moved his entire family to England, declaring that American society was vulgar and beneath him. Before he left, he made one final decision that would change Manhattan forever. He owned the land his mansion sat on, right next door to Caroline, and he decided that if he couldn't be the head of the Astor family in New York society, he would make sure Caroline's reign ended in the most public and humiliating way possible. He tore down his mansion and announced he was building a hotel on the site. Not just any hotel, the tallest, most luxurious hotel in New York, right next door to where Caroline lived, where she held her famous balls, where she maintained her position as the queen of society. A hotel meant noise. It meant strangers. It meant commercial activity right next to the most exclusive residential address in Manhattan. It meant Caroline's mansion would go from being the center of high society to being next door to a business. Her property value would plummet, her social events would be disrupted, her reign would be over. Caroline was furious. She tried to stop the construction through legal challenges, but William Waldorf owned the land outright. She tried social pressure, but William Waldorf was in England and didn't care what. New York society thought. She tried appealing to family loyalty, but that ship had sailed years ago. The Waldorf Hotel opened in 1893. It was 13 stories tall, had 530 rooms, and was designed to be the most luxurious hotel America had ever seen. It had electric lighting, private bathrooms, and a main dining room that could seat 1,500 people. It was magnificent, modern, and positioned exactly where it would cause Caroline the maximum amount of suffering. But William Waldorf had miscalculated one thing. He had assumed Caroline would give up and move. Instead, she stayed. She lived next door to a hotel, hosted parties while strangers checked into rooms next door, and maintained her position as Mrs. Astor out of sheer spite. And then Caroline's son, John Jacob Astor IV, made a decision that shocked everyone. If William Waldorf could build a hotel, so could he. And his hotel would be even bigger. John Jacob Astor IV was everything his cousin William Waldorf was not. Where William Waldorf was bitter and political, John Jacob IV was charming and scientifically minded. He had graduated from Harvard. He had invented things, including a bicycle brake and a pneumatic road improver. He wrote science fiction novels. He was fascinated by technology and the future. But he was also fiercely loyal to his mother, Caroline. And when he saw how William Waldorf had humiliated her by building a hotel next door, he decided to fight back in the only way that made sense. He would tear down his mother's mansion and build an even bigger hotel right next to the Waldorf. Caroline agreed to the plan on one condition. The new hotel, which would be called the Astoria, would be built with a specific architectural feature. There would be a partition wall between the Waldorf and the Astoria that could be bricked up at any moment if the partnership failed. If the family feud flared up again, the two hotels could be separated instantly and operate as competitors. The plan was audacious. Instead of one hotel, there would be two hotels operating side by side but technically separate. They would share some facilities but maintain independence. Guests could move between them, but the buildings could be sealed off from each other if necessary. Construction on the Astoria began in 1895. When it opened in 1897, it was 17 stories tall, taller than the Waldorf. It had 400 rooms, its own grand ballroom, its own restaurants, and its own entrance on Fifth Avenue. Together, the Waldorf and Astoria formed the largest hotel in the world. Nearly 1,000 rooms, multiple ballrooms, restaurants, bars, barbershops, libraries, and facilities that had never existed in a hotel before. It was called the Waldorf-Astoria, with a hyphen to indicate the uneasy partnership. But the hyphen represented more than just architectural connection. It represented a truce in a war that had defined the Astor family for a generation. William Waldorf was in England. John Jacob IV was in charge in New York. And for the moment, both sides benefited more from cooperation than from continued conflict. The Waldorf-Astoria became the center of American high society almost immediately. The wealthy and powerful who had attended Caroline's balls now attended events at the hotel. Presidents stayed there. Foreign dignitaries stayed there. Millionaires who wanted to be seen stayed there. The hotel created a new standard for luxury. Guests expected private bathrooms, which were still rare in most hotels. They expected electric lights, elevators, room service, and impeccable service from staff who were trained to anticipate needs before guests even asked. The Waldorf-Astoria introduced the concept of the hotel as social space, not just a place to sleep. The main dining room, called Peacock Alley because of how guests would strut through it in their finest. Clothes became the place to see and be seen. If you wanted to know who mattered in New York, you watched who walked through Peacock Alley. The hotel also innovated on the business side. The Waldorf-Astoria was one of the first hotels to host major business conferences and events. Companies would rent entire floors for meetings. Trade organizations would hold conventions there. The idea that a hotel could be a business hub, not just a vacation destination, started at the Waldorf-Astoria. And then there was the food. The Waldorf-Astoria's restaurants set standards that shaped American fine dining for generations. The hotel employed some of the best chefs in the world. They created dishes that became classics, including Waldorf salad, eggs Benedict, and Thousand Island dressing, all of which were either invented or popularized at the hotel. The head chef, Oscar Chirky, known as Oscar of the Waldorf, became almost as famous as the hotel itself. He knew every important person in New York. He remembered their preferences, their dietary restrictions, their favorite tables. If Oscar seated you in a good spot, you mattered. If Oscar didn't know your name, you weren't important yet. For nearly 40 years, the Waldorf-Astoria defined American luxury, but the building had a problem. It was in the wrong location. By the 1920s, Fifth Avenue and 33rd Street was no longer the center of wealthy residential Manhattan. The city was growing north. Grand Central Terminal had opened at 42nd Street. The best shops and restaurants were moving uptown. The Waldorf-Astoria's location, which had been perfect in 1890, was outdated by 1925. The hotel's owners faced a choice. They could stay in the old building and watch it become irrelevant as the city moved past it. Or they could tear it down and rebuild somewhere better. In 1928, they made the decision. The Waldorf-Astoria would be demolished. The land would be sold. And a new, even more spectacular Waldorf-Astoria would be built uptown on Park Avenue between 49th and 50th Streets. The announcement shocked New York. The Waldorf-Astoria had been a landmark for 35 years. Tearing it down felt like destroying a piece of the city's identity. But the owners were ruthless about business. Sentiment didn't matter, profit did. The old Waldorf-Astoria closed its doors on May 1st, 1929, just months before the stock market crash that would trigger the Great Depression. The timing couldn't have been worse for what came next. The land where the hotel had stood was sold to a developer who planned to build the tallest building in the world on that site. That building would become the Empire State Building, and the new Waldorf-Astoria would be built during the worst economic crisis in American history. If you're enjoying the story so far, make sure you're subscribed for more true history like this. Breaking ground on the world's most luxurious hotel in October 1929, the same month the stock market crashed, was either incredibly brave or completely insane. The developers behind the new Waldorf-Astoria chose to believe it was brave. The new hotel would be built on an entire city block at Park Avenue between 49th and 50th Streets. It would be 47 stories tall, making it the tallest hotel in the world. It would have 2,000 rooms, more than twice the capacity of the old Waldorf-Astoria, and it would cost $42 million to build, an astronomical sum in 1930. The problem was simple. The Great Depression had destroyed the economy. Banks were failing. Unemployment was skyrocketing. People who had been millionaires in 1928 were broke by 1930. Building a luxury hotel for wealthy travelers when most of the country was struggling to eat seemed tone-deaf at best and criminally wasteful at worst. But the developers had already bought the land and started construction. Stopping would mean losing everything they had invested, so they kept building, even as the economic situation got worse. Construction employed thousands of workers at a time when jobs were almost impossible to find. Men who had lost everything in the crash lined up for the chance to work on the new Waldorf-Astoria. The pay was decent by Depression standards. The work was hard, dangerous, and relentless, but it was work. The architects designed the hotel to be more than just large. It needed to be spectacular enough to justify its existence during an economic crisis. The main lobby featured a marble floor with a reproduction of the Wheel of Life, a 9 by 12-foot mosaic made of thousands of pieces of colored marble. The ballroom could hold 3,000 people. The kitchens were designed to prepare meals for 10,000 guests per day. Every room had a private bathroom, which was still not standard in most hotels. Every room had a radio built into the wall. The hotel had its own hospital, its own power plant, and its own refrigeration system capable of making 3 tons of ice per day. The construction was finished in 1931, right on schedule. The new Waldorf-Astoria opened on October 1st, 1931, with a grand opening celebration that tried very hard to pretend the Depression wasn't happening. President Herbert Hoover gave a radio address from the White House to mark the opening. Celebrities attended. The press covered it extensively. For one night, New York pretended it was still the Roaring Twenties and that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The Waldorf-Astoria had been built for a world of wealth and excess that no longer existed. The 2,000 rooms were designed for travelers who could afford $50 a night for a room, at a time when the average American worker made about $25 per week. In the first year, the hotel struggled to fill even half its rooms. Wealthy travelers were cutting back on expenses. Business conferences were being canceled. The grand ballroom sat empty more often than they were used. The Waldorf-Astoria was a spectacular monument to a dead economy. But the hotel survived because it was willing to adapt. Management started offering lower rates to attract middle-class travelers, not just millionaires. They hosted smaller events in the ballrooms to generate revenue from local New Yorkers who couldn't afford to stay overnight, but could pay for a wedding reception or a business dinner. The hotel also leaned heavily into celebrity culture. If famous people stayed at the Waldorf-Astoria, regular people would want to stay there too. So management made sure that every celebrity, politician, and important person who visited New York knew they were welcome at the Waldorf. Presidents stayed there. Foreign heads of state stayed there, movie stars, athletes, musicians, and anyone else who mattered made the Waldorf-Astoria their New York home base. The hotel employed publicists whose entire job was making sure the newspapers knew who was staying there and what they were doing. By the mid-1930s, the strategy was working. The Waldorf-Astoria was becoming synonymous with fame and importance. If you stayed there, you mattered. And if you mattered, you stayed there. It was a self-reinforcing cycle that turned the hotel into an institution. But the family feud that had started the whole thing was entering its final, tragic chapter. John Jacob Astor IV, the man who had built the Astoria to defend his mother's honor, died in 1912. But not peacefully in old age. He died on the Titanic. Astor had been traveling in Europe with his second wife, Madeline, who was 18 years old and pregnant. They boarded the Titanic in Cherbourg for the voyage back to New York. When the ship hit the iceberg, Astor helped his wife into a lifeboat, then stepped back because the rule was women and children first. He was last seen standing on the deck, smoking a cigarette as the ship went down. His body was recovered a week later. He was 47 years old and one of the wealthiest men in the world. His fortune at the time of his death was estimated at $87 million. The irony was brutal. John Jacob Astor IV had spent years fighting a family feud over hotels and social status. He had built the Astoria to spite his cousin. He had helped create the most famous hotel in America, and in the end, none of it mattered. He died in the freezing North Atlantic, and all the money and all the hotels couldn't save him. William Waldorf Astor, the man who had started the feud by building the original Waldorf, outlived his cousin by 7 years. He died in 1919 in England, having never returned to America after leaving in 1891. He had become a British citizen, bought a castle, and been made a Viscount by King George V. Both men had spent their lives fighting over who deserved to be called the head of the Astor family. Both had built hotels to prove their point, and in the end, both were dead, while the hotel they had accidentally created together became more famous than either of them. The Waldorf-Astoria outlived the feud, outlived the men who created it, and became something neither of them had intended. It became an American institution. By the 1940s, the Waldorf-Astoria had survived the Depression and established itself as the most important hotel in America. But World War II would test whether it could maintain that status during a global conflict. During the war, the hotel became a hub for political and diplomatic activity. Foreign governments in exile set up offices there. Allied military leaders coordinated strategy over dinner in the hotel's private dining rooms. Refugees from occupied Europe who had managed to escape with their fortunes stayed there while figuring out what to do next. The hotel's ballrooms were used for war bond fundraisers. The kitchens prepared meals for thousands of soldiers passing through New York on their way to deployment. The Waldorf-Astoria became a symbol of American power and stability at a time when the rest of the world was on fire. After the war ended, the hotel entered what many consider its golden age. The late 1940s and 1950s were when the Waldorf-Astoria truly became the standard for luxury hospitality worldwide. Every president from Herbert Hoover through Barack Obama stayed at the Waldorf-Astoria when visiting New York. The hotel maintained a permanent suite called the Presidential Suite, designed specifically for heads of state. The suite occupied the entire 42nd floor and came with its own kitchen, dining room, and secure elevator access. Foreign dignitaries treated the Waldorf-Astoria as a neutral meeting ground. Nikita Khrushchev stayed there. In 1959, during his visit to the United States, even though it was the height of the Cold War, Fidel Castro stayed there in 1960, though he reportedly complained about the luxury and ended up sleeping in Central Park to make a political point. The hotel became famous for its permanent residents. People who were wealthy enough didn't just stay at the Waldorf-Astoria for a night or a week. They lived there. The hotel had residential towers where people could lease apartments and live full-time with access to all the hotel's services. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor lived at the Waldorf-Astoria for years. Herbert Hoover lived there after his presidency. Frank Sinatra kept a suite. Cole Porter wrote many of his most famous songs while living at the Waldorf-Astoria. Living at the hotel became the ultimate status symbol. The hotel also became central to American popular culture. It appeared in movies, television shows, and novels as the shorthand for wealth and sophistication. If a character in a film stayed at the Waldorf-Astoria, the audience immediately understood they were rich and important. The hotel's restaurants continued to innovate and set trends. The Waldorf-Astoria was where America's elite learned about international cuisine. The hotel employed chefs from France, Italy, and other countries who introduced dishes that most Americans had never tried. Eating at the Waldorf-Astoria was a culinary education. But the hotel's success created a problem. By the 1960s and 70s, the Waldorf-Astoria was so associated with old wealth and traditional luxury that it started to feel dated. Younger travelers wanted something different. They wanted modern design, casual elegance, and hotels that felt less formal and stuffy. The rise of boutique hotels and international luxury chains, like the Four Seasons, started to chip away at the Waldorf-Astoria's dominance. The hotel was still famous, still prestigious, but it was no longer the only option for travelers who wanted luxury. The hotel changed ownership multiple times over the decades. In 1949, it was purchased by Conrad Hilton, founder of the Hilton hotel chain, for $3 million. Hilton recognized the value of the Waldorf-Astoria brand and maintained the hotel's standards while using it as the flagship property for his expanding hotel empire. Under Hilton's ownership, the Waldorf-Astoria remained profitable and prestigious, but it also became part of a larger corporate structure. It was no longer an independent institution. It was a brand, a property in a portfolio, a luxury product in a competitive market. In 2014, Hilton sold the Waldorf-Astoria to a Chinese insurance company called Anbang Insurance Group for just under $2 billion. The sale shocked many New Yorkers who saw the hotel as a piece of American heritage. The idea that a Chinese company would own the Waldorf-Astoria felt wrong to people, who remembered when the hotel represented American power and prestige. The new owners closed the hotel in 2017 for a complete renovation that is still ongoing as of 2025. The plan is to convert many of the hotel rooms into luxury condominiums while maintaining some hotel operations. When the renovation is complete, the Waldorf-Astoria will be a hybrid property, part hotel and part high-end residences. The transformation reflects broader changes in the luxury hotel industry. Owning a luxury hotel is less profitable than selling luxury condominiums. Travelers want experiences, not just rooms. The old model of grand hotels with 2,000 rooms is outdated, but the Waldorf-Astoria's legacy remains intact. It proved that a hotel could be more than just a place to sleep. It could be a social hub, a political meeting ground, a cultural institution, and a symbol of aspiration. And it all started because two cousins hated each other so much that they built competing hotels just to spite each other. The Waldorf-Astoria exists because William Waldorf-Astor wanted to humiliate his Aunt Caroline. That's the origin story. A family feud so petty that it resulted in tearing down mansions and building hotels just to annoy relatives. But what started as spite became something much larger. The Waldorf-Astoria helped define what luxury meant in America. It set standards for service, design, and hospitality that influenced every high-end hotel built afterward. It showed that hotels could be destinations in themselves, not just places to stay while visiting somewhere else. The hotel also reflected darker aspects of American society. The Waldorf-Astoria was built for wealthy white Americans during a time of extreme inequality. The staff who made the hotel function were largely immigrants and people of color who were paid low wages to serve people who spent more on one dinner than the staff made in a month. The hotel's history is full of labor. Disputes, strikes, and conflicts between management and workers over pay and conditions. The luxury that guests experienced was built on the backs of people who could never afford to stay there themselves. The residential towers, where the wealthiest New Yorkers lived, existed in the same building as basement kitchens where workers labored in sweltering heat for 12 hours a day. The contrast was stark and intentional. Luxury required invisible labor. The Waldorf-Astoria also played a complicated role in American politics and international relations. It was where deals were made, where powerful people met away from public scrutiny, where foreign governments negotiated with American officials in private dining rooms. Some of those meetings shaped history for the better. Others were backroom deals that benefited the wealthy at the expense of ordinary people. The hotel was a tool, and like any tool, it could be used for good or ill depending on who was using it. But focusing too much on the politics and economics misses something important about the Waldorf-Astoria's cultural impact. For generations of Americans, the hotel represented aspiration. It was a symbol of what you could achieve if you worked hard and succeeded. Staying at the Waldorf-Astoria meant you had made it. That symbolism was powerful even for people who could never afford to stay there. The hotel appeared in movies, songs, and stories as the ultimate destination. It was part of the American dream, the idea that success was possible and that it looked like checking into the Waldorf-Astoria. The family feud that created the hotel has long since faded into history. The Astors are no longer the powerful dynasty they once were. Their wealth has been divided among so many descendants that no single family member has the kind of power that William Waldorf or John Jacob IV wielded. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the woman whose social reign sparked the feud, died in 1908 by the end of her life. She had dementia and no longer recognized most of the people around her. The woman who had controlled New York society for decades ended her life confused and diminished. William Waldorf Astor died wealthy but bitter, having spent his final years in England writing angry letters about American society and trying to prove he had made the right choice by leaving. He never reconciled with the American branch of his family. John Jacob Astor IV died a hero on the Titanic, remembered for his calm in the face of disaster and his adherence to the code that women and children should be saved first. But he died leaving behind a young widow and an unborn child, both of whom would face scandal and social rejection in the years that followed. The Waldorf-Astoria outlived all of them. It survived the Depression, World War II, social changes, economic upheavals, and shifts in the hotel industry. It remains one of the most recognizable hotel brands in the world, even as the original building undergoes transformation into condominiums. In the end, the Waldorf-Astoria story is about unintended consequences. William Waldorf Astor built a hotel to spite his aunt. His cousin built a bigger hotel to defend his mother's honor. Neither of them intended to create an institution that would outlast their feud and define American luxury for over a century. But that's exactly what happened. The spite, the rivalry, the family hatred, all of it faded. What remained was the hotel. A building that started as a weapon in a family war became a symbol of achievement, a meeting place for the powerful, and a piece of American cultural history. The Waldorf-Astoria was built on a family feud, but it became something much greater than the petty conflict that created it. And maybe that's the most important lesson. Sometimes the best things we create come from the worst reasons. Sometimes spite builds something that outlasts the hatred that inspired it. The Waldorf-Astoria stands as proof that even the most dysfunctional families can accidentally create something beautiful. They just don't get to control what it becomes. For more real stories behind iconic landmarks and powerful families, subscribe to the channel.